fellow travelers, and welcome to another episode, the Verse of the Stars podcast, third season. How my loyal listeners, thank you for helping me on my quest to 1,000 subscribers. It's an amazing episode today because Jed MacKay boards the mothership. You know him as the writer of The Vengeance of Moon Knight. Now come aboard as we go traversing the stars. Hi, Mr. MacKay. Thanks so much for coming to Verse of the Stars podcast.
Thanks for having me. Always happy to talk comic books.
It's a total honor. Like I'm a huge fan of your work with Moon Knight, which we're about to talk about. So thank you so much for doing this for me.
Oh, no problem.
I always start off with a question of inspiration. What inspired your love for writing and who are your earliest influences?
Uh, my love for writing came at an early age, and a lot of it was in the stuff that I was reading when I was a kid, which a lot of it was old superhero comic books for the most part. My dad um, collected comics when he was younger, through the 70s. And when I was a kid, I grew up reading all that stuff because, I mean, it's already there. They don't have to buy new books when I got like three Rubbermaid containers beside my desk of all those old books. And a lot of it came from that. And I think my love for writing came from me looking at these stories and other stories. There's lots of stuff I was absorbing when I was a kid and thinking, I really love this. I want more of it. What could I make more of this? Like, how could I have these stories? And it's fun to make things up, make up characters, make up situations, and throw them together. So I was writing stories from a pretty young age. None of them were very good, but there's words to pay for. I've got a notebook from like when I was in the sixth grade where I was decided I was going to write a novel, and like I filled up a whole, in Canada we call them scribblers, in cursive, writing like some terrible fantasy story, and like it was awful, but it's a fun artifact to kind of look back and say like, well, this is what I wanted to do even that far back.
Now, when you're writing when you were a kid, obviously the quality of the writing as a kid is not going to be great because you're a kid.
No.
But has
So
any
some might argue it's not there now, but
has any of the ideas that kind of came up when you were a kid made it into your adult writing? Like you were like, hey, I came up with this character, this plot. I wonder if that works for.
hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. Let me think. Um, Certainly nothing I can think of off the top of my head. Certainly a lot of the stuff that I write is influenced by the things I read when I was a kid. Let me like most comic writers.
Right.
Like that first Daughters of the Dragon series I did was very much a love letter to old comics I loved, spy comics, like Nick Fury stuff, Master of Kung Fu stuff. But as far as those old creations, the earliest I can probably trace that back is not really that far, I guess. Like Rutherford Winter from Daughters of the Dragon, and then later Moon Knight. Um, Started out as a character I made up for something else called Codename Paracelian. This idea of someone who has lost their identity in a sea of cover identities. I mean, I guess that's not even it anymore with Winter. But anyways, like I said, it doesn't go as far back as that. That said, there's still ideas kicking around. We'll see what comes out down the line. I can always reach further and further back into my history as I become more and more creatively bankrupt.
Yeah, were you ever a fan of the Big Bang Theory TV show?
No, it's never been my thing.
There was an episode where Sheldon found his old notebooks from when he was a kid, and he's trying to see if there's any great ideas that were found in there. So you're gonna
Yeah.
one day, that's where you're probably gonna go back into your, reminisce some of your old story, and be like,
Oh
oh my
yeah.
God, there's a nugget of genius. That was my sixth grade story.
Yeah, I mean, like I've still got all my old sketchbooks when I was a kid, back when I thought I was also going to draw comics as well as write them. So I'm sure at some point I'll pull something out when I'm like sweating a deadline and like I got to find something for this.
So, for those who don't know, but most people probably do, that you're the writer for Moon Knight and now Vengeance of Moon Knight
Mhm.
is a brilliant series.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. I found it like probably some people did from the TV shows, like, hey, Moon Knight, that's kind of cool. And I was like, I wonder what's going on in his comic book because I knew the character, but I didn't know much about him. And I found it absolutely genius and how it was written. Um, the tone was fantastic. The characterization was fantastic. Um, my question on that is Moon Knight it's never has never been a character that has had before the TV show massive amount of spotlight to it. So what led
Mhm.
you to think there was something to mine in Moon Knight that maybe other writers had not mined out yet?
Um, I think that's a question that is maybe based off of um, an inaccurate premise. Because I didn't come to them and say, "Hey, here's an idea for a Moon Knight thing." Rather, like a lot of things, Marvel looks at, say, we have a TV show coming out with Moon Knight coming soon. There's a lot of interest in this character, so we're going to start a new series. Like a lot of things, we take advantage of larger pop culture attention on a character and use that to hopefully funnel some of that attention or ride ride the slipstream of that attention to try something new in comics or try a new series or something. It's the same thing. I have my Taskmaster book or my Daughter's the Dragon book for that matter. Anyways, the thing with Moon Knight is that he's a character who has had wildly different interpretations throughout his entire existence in comic books. Gone for anything from like very grounded crime fighter to like very super heroic to um, you know unhinged maniac to the range is endless. Like the moon, he changes. So that's why I was really excited. But also at the same time, he's not a character who I think is locked to a specific, all-time great interpretation because people always argue what the iconic or the best Moon Knight interpretation is. You know, most people go Lemire, which obviously it makes a lot of sense. A lot of people just go back, to the Mensch days with Sinkovich, and the whole range. People always argue about that, which is something I find really interesting about the character because no one can really agree on what is the most important Moon Knight run or like what is the most definitive Moon Knight run, and especially going into the modern period. So because of that, you have a lot of room to work with because he's not someone who's locked down to a specific point in time that people think this was the best. It's never going to be as good again, which is really exciting as a writer. Because if you're writing like I don't know, if someone's writing X-Men, you always think, well, how's this going to stack up against the Claremont Byrne era? Because that's always what people, or the Jim Lee era, which because those are kind of the two big eras where people like that was when it was the best. You get less of that with Moon Knight because no one can agree on when it was the best. And if that's the case, then maybe mine could be the best, hypothetically speaking, which is a very exciting place to be as a writer.
Hmm. So when you're thinking of Moon Knight, one obviously the major aspects of his character, there's actually two significant parts that I'm thinking of. One, multiple personalities that
Yep.
that he's
The
had.
DID.
Yeah. When you're thinking about that aspect of the character, does that make it more challenging to write a character, or does it make it easier because you can kind of fit the persona to the top storyline that you're looking for?
I think it makes more. I think it presents an additional challenge, especially because something like DID has been so inaccurately portrayed throughout the existence of media because it's something that can be used in a very flashy, um, very exploitive way in some cases. And I'm not talking about Moon Knight. I'm not even just talking about comics. I'm talking about in all of media, films, books, everything. Anytime someone's suffering from DID, but in a very showy and often inaccurate way, in a way that's all very stigmatic. So when I approached Moon Knight's DID, first off, it was kind of put aside for about like the first 14 issues or so, in part because one of the things going in is we didn't want, well, coming from editorial, we couldn't have it be all about DID, couldn't have it all about Khonshu. So I wanted to see what Moon Knight was without focusing on those topics because they generally are kind of like there's just so much gravity in them. They
Hmm.
suck the whole story in. So I wanted to try something else separate from that. But also because I wanted to learn more about it and figure out a way to portray it, hopefully, more accurately, more respectfully. So I think it's a really interesting aspect of the character, and to have three characters in one with Marc Spector and Jake Lockley and Steve Grant, and it's presents its difficulties, presents its problems, but I think it also presents a lot of opportunities in telling stories because you have a character who is essentially his own supporting cast, and you don't see that much.
So I think another thing that's kind of interesting after the character that you explored in case actually in Vengeance of Moon Knight, because for those who don't know, Marc Spector is allegedly killed at the end of Moon Knight. I'm gonna say allegedly because we don't quite
All
know.
right.
Yeah, definitely. You're gonna confirm that he's definitely dead.
I mean, I'm going to say R.I.P.
Well, I think one of the cool thing that you had with Vengeance of Moon Knight too is that you in the death you actually introduced or didn't introduce, but did a little bit on the Jewish aspect of who Marc Spector is as well, which I think was very important, especially in current day and age where there's anti-Semitism growing and stuff like that. How important
Sure.
was it to recognize aspects of that character in the beginning of Vengeance of Moon Knight?
And I think it's very important because anytime you have a character die, quite frequently there's going to be some sort of religious connotations with their, uh, not even funeral, but just their bereavement ceremonies. So it was something that I wanted to make sure we acknowledged and tried to do kind of as right as possible. Um, and also narratively, it served a very good purpose for showing this memorial for this character and like bringing people together, um, and showing how his supporting cast is trying to do right by him, despite the fact they don't really know what they're doing. Hence Ben Grimm turning up. So yeah, it's something that I think Mark's Judaism, his Jewish identity and heritage is something that's very interesting in Moon Knight. And, we've talked about it a little bit. Would have been Moon Knight number 5, I think. This kind of conflict between the way he was raised and the way he lives now. Between the God of his father and the God he works for now, or ostensibly, or worked for, I guess. Um, and I think there's a lot of really interesting push and pull there. And at the same time, it's not something you want to erase. It's not something you want to
Right.
forget or like brush under the rug because it's just people are looking for that. It's important to people to see themselves and see their culture and these characters that we work with.
That's why I like I appreciate it. Someone who's Jewish, I was like, good. I like you put that nice touch in there, having Ben Grimm in there as well. I think it was a nice layers to add to not just cultural, but to the character as well. I thought that was a fantastic thing to have done.
Yeah.
I appreciate that.
Oh, it's good. I'm glad you liked it. A lot of work for you. And we're not going to get everything right. I'm not Jewish. Thankfully, I have friends who help me out and point me in the right direction. Um, but we try to do the best that we can.
Now, to excuse the pun, Mark
Sure.
has left Spectre over the Midnight
Hey,
the Midnight Mission at the moment, which is I know I had to put that little pun in there because it's there. But
sure.
the question that for those who are now in charge of the Midnight Mission is the goal to maintain Mark's influence, or is it to find their own way and own voice within it?
It's a bit of both. It's maintaining Mark's legacy, I would say, and maintaining the positive effect. We're trying to figure out how to do that without the driving engine of that, which is Moon Knight, which is Marc Spector. Um, you know, Marc Spector as Moon Knight, and then later Jake Lockley as Stephen Grant were the driving engine behind the Midnight Mission. It's something born out of his need for redemption and his need to find a new way. And now that he's gone, the you know the rest of the Midnight Mission gang have to figure out how they fit together in this without him.
So, because Mark is such a major was such a big personality in the Midnight Mission,
Mhm.
is there room for them to forge their own path?
I think so. We'll see how that goes. It was certainly a lot easier for them before this new Moon Knight turned up and started messing with their shit. So um, that's a lot of the thrust of these first handful of issues is, and I think we especially see it discussed in issue 3. Yeah, issue 3, which is so issue 1 was the Reese focus. Issue 2 is Tigra. Issue 3 is going to be Soldier, and we see Soldier's observations of what the Midnight Mission is and what it means to him, and how the people within it work together. So yeah, we'll see some meditations on that idea in I guess March.
One thing I really liked in the first issue is there's a quote. If you don't mind, I'm going to read the quote.
Sure.
from Peace, who's, for those who don't know, is a vampire, and right now, I guess the current head of the Midnight Mission at the moment, or at least representing them as their leader at the moment. She states, I got a job to do. When I inherited, I quit college to run the Midnight Mission, and why shouldn't I? I'm a vampire. I'm going to be 19 forever. Now,
Yeah.
her perspective is going to be a lot different than almost anybody else's. She can
Sure.
have technically a very long view of the Midnight Mission and the fight that they're going to be having, right? With against
Yeah.
evil and everything else. So how does that perspective change how she can run the Midnight Mission with that idea?
Part of it is that a lot of this stuff is you're like, oh, well, I'm going to leave my old life behind to do this weird superhero life. For Reese, leaving her old life behind essentially happened the night she got turned into a vampire, which was, shortly before she met Moon Knight. So for her, it's less of a drastic shift because she's been gradually uh, becoming this role for the entire run of the book. Since she turned up in Moon Knight #1, and to the point where Mark says he left her in charge in 29, I think it was 30, no, 29, I think, or 28. I don't know, one of them. Somebody showed Moon Knight. So she's been gradually um, stepping up to this role. This isn't a dramatic change for her. It's just now she's going to be the person who sits in the chair and says, "Welcome to the Midnight Mission. How can we help you?"
Now, the thing with Reese as well is that kind of in how she's phrasing it, I inherited this. I got a job to do. Why shouldn't I? And honestly, she didn't, and not choosing to be a vampire really. How much of this is what she truly wants for herself in the future? How much does she feel obligated to play this role?
I mean, I think that's something that she's probably asking herself. Um, it's very easy to get pulled into a role like this in the wake of a tragedy, like the death of Moon Knight after the final raid against Black Spector. Um, and again, Reese is very young. This is the kind of thing that a young person will throw themselves into with gusto. How long that lasts, we'll see.
Now, was it having been not technically 19 forever?
Sure.
I don't remember a lot about being 19, but I don't remember being the most responsible in 19. Since being 19. How much is she still the 19-year-old? And is that too much to ask of a 19-year-old?
Of course, it's too much to ask. But the entire history of Moon Knight as a character is asking people to do impossible things
Hmm.
in difficult situations. Like that's where Moon Knight comes from. Khonshu goes to a dead man and says, "Throw away your entire culture and religion and work for me, the historic oppressor of your people. But in return, I'll let you break as many skulls as you want and like fulfill your addiction to violence." Like the entire character of Moon Knight and then his legacy rolling out is based on these kind of
Hmm.
unfair choices, these unfair what's the word? Impositions of responsibility
Hmm.
and calls to violence. So yeah, it's very much of a piece with the core tenets and the core themes of Moon Knight as a character, Moon Knight as a title.
So once again, looking at it from the perspective of a vampire,
Mhm.
Khonshu, how much are we gonna get his it's him or it? Would it be him or an it, technically, Khonshu? Would you because I mean he's a god. So I don't know if you would him or an it.
I think we generally refer to conscious.
All right. So how would does it Khonshu feel about Reese being its representative in the Midnight Mission at the moment?
It's a very good question. It also doesn't really matter because he's in jail. He doesn't get a say. He's been banged up in Asgard since Age of Khonshu. So, but I mean, that is also a certain amount of Mark's influence, where Mark, he's carried on his job without Khonshu's approval, since he put Khonshu in Asgardian jail back in Avengers. So, um, a casual disregard for what the bird god wants is pretty on brand for Moon Knight, and then Moon Knight's appointed successor as the head of the Midnight Mission.
So we also have Hunter's Moon, who, for all intents and purposes, is 100% devout to in faith of Khonshu.
Mhm.
From what we know of Khonshu, and like you said, Jason Aaron's run some previous runs. How well placed is this faith in a guy who doesn't necessarily seem to be most honorable, perhaps? Of
I mean, that's a question that Hunter's Moon is coming to ask himself. As we saw in Moon Knight Annual #1, uh, he goes against Khonshu's wishes. He doesn't kill Beatrice when Khonshu tells him that he has to. So when we first see Hunter's Moon back in Moon Knight #1, he's very very orthodox Khonshu worshiper. Very much. I mean, again, quoting a religious text that has nothing to do with either of them. But he's very much the Old Testament to Mark's New Testament when it comes to the Gospel of Khonshu. Um, but he's loosening up as time goes on. He's questioning Khonshu. He hangs out with vampires now when he thought that was a thing that really sucked that Mark was doing back in Moon Knight #2 or no 3. So yeah, like we're starting to see Hunter's Moon grow into himself and question his faith to a certain extent. Like he's still loyal to Khonshu. He's still, and that's a big part of his identity, and especially for him, a big part of what makes him him in comparison to Mark.
and now the fact that Mark has died and seemingly has stayed dead, because I know he's reincarnated a few times, but definitely is dead. Um, does that shake faith as well, knowing that one of the servants of Khonshu did die? Is not they're not as potentially as formidable, maybe as he is maybe in his own mind before that.
Um, that's again, that's something we explore in 1, 2, 3, 4, #4, which is the Hunter's Moon focus. Um, but the thing with Hunter's Moon is, he's sad that Mark is dead, and that sucks. But that's dying is part of being a fist of Khonshu. However, if Mark has died and he can't come back, that means Hunter's Moon, when he dies, and he'll die at some point, he
Mm.
can't come back either. And that means there's no more Fist of Khonshu after that. And that's something that desperately frightens him.
So
Because this is something he's dedicated his life to, and for it to no longer exist is the worst thing he can think of.
now, even though Khonshu, as you said, he with Asgard, he
Mhm.
obviously there's a new Moon Knight hanging around. It's
Mhm.
only at the moment only the first issue out, so we know very little about the character.
Mhm.
That does demonstrate that Khonshu still has the ability to influence our world.
Does it?
So, is it possible? Can there be a Moon Knight without Khonshu at all?
I mean, there. If someone puts on a bunch of moon-shaped clothing, there's no lightning bolt going to strike them out of the sky.
Good point.
The existence of this Moon Knight does not necessarily mean this is someone with Khonshu's blessing, though. Maybe it does.
Hmm.
Um, we're leaving things pretty wide open here. But in your thinking, you know, anybody could put on a Moon Knight outfit if they want to.
Hmm.
Anybody could put on a Spider-Man outfit if they want to. Um, I, I mean, we had Soldier dress up as Moon Knight in #11. So, it's not just limited to whoever Khonshu says can do it.
Well, I mean, to look at the title Vengeance of Moon Knight,
Mm-hmm.
one would assume that the perspective of the series is on some level Moon Knight. Now, you introduce a Moon Knight dressed character.
Mm-hmm.
How much is perspective or tone shifting going to shift towards the new Moon Knight, and how much are we going to stay with those who are already in the Midnight Mission?
Well, a large part, I mean, as we'll see in a couple weeks, a large thrust of the series is where we see the Midnight Mission versus Moon Knight. Moon Knight, as we've seen in this first issue, is an antagonistic force to our heroes, who are the Midnight Mission gang. I gotta come up with a better name for them other than the Midnight Mission gang. That sounds like a child's cartoon from the '70s. But so yeah, that's a lot of it is they're dealing, as we said before, how to fulfill this legacy, how to keep this memory alive,
Hmm.
while at the same time dealing with someone who has a radical completely different interpretation of how this should be done. So we're going to see the Midnight Mission gang, essentially on a crash course with Moon Knight until things get to come to a head and we have uh, explosive revelation, we'll say.
So at the moment, only the first issue has been released yet, of Avengers of the
Yep.
Moon. So I know you said the next issue is going to focus more on Tigra. In the
Mhm.
first issue, she doesn't seem to be handling her grief all that well. She seems, at least in my opinion, she seems very much motivated now through anger, and seems very
Yep.
dangerous from that. Um, how close is her behavior a thread that could easily undo what's going on with the Midnight Mission right now? How dangerous is her behavior to the rest?
Um, I mean, again, it remains to be seen, right? Tigra is at least half a tiger. And so her priorities are going to be different than people with a different set of instincts, specifically, human instincts. Um, which again, is something that we talked about back in, I don't remember the issue that had the tiger focus, Midnight Man issue. The number, I can't remember. I mean,
Hmm.
so, and I mean, also, this is something we'll explore in the next issue, but, Tiger is someone who's experienced a great deal of loss. And this added to that is extremely unhealthy for her.
Hmm.
So we're gonna explore that in this next issue in depth. So I guess I can just say stay tuned.
So, what kind of things can you tease for our listeners for the future of Avengers of Moon Knight?
Um, we're not going to stretch things out too much for you. We're setting up our dominoes to knock them down fairly quickly. We're gonna unmask Moon Knight. We get some answers, and from there it's just gonna get wilder because we're gonna be feeding right into Blood Hunt, and that's a global crossover extravaganza. So it's gonna be good.
From when you thought of plotting this, was that all already like in the plan to get to with Bloodhunt and having that all intertwined with each other, or was that something that got introduced after you started plotting what you were going to do with the series?
Don't know, to be quite honest, because I had a few different ideas. Like I knew that I wanted to kill Moon Knight. As I can think of it as early as not last year's New York Comic Con, but the year before. So remember, I met Alessandro Puccio for the first time. I were sitting together, and I was like, "Listen, here's what I want to do. I'm gonna see if I can get Tom to let us kill Moon Knight, and like also I'm gonna have 8 Ball join the Midnight Mission." And he's like, "Sure, that sounds great." And again, like going to Vengeance of the Moon Knight wasn't my original plan. I would have been happier to have Moon Knight number 31 because I like seeing the number go up. But
Yeah.
Marvel loves to do number one. It's it's just a fact of the business. So, um, but yeah, I think gradually, as I was planning Vengeance, I was also planning Blood Hunt, and originally it was quite different because I think originally when I was planning my first draft of Blood Hunt, I don't think Moon Knight had died yet because I remember my first draft of Blood Hunt had Moon Knight in it. But again, we're talking like I think March of last year. No, March of the year before. No, March of last year, I think I did my first draft. No, like second or third draft of Blood Hunt. So this is going like pretty far back. Um, but yeah, like I do remember that like Moon Knight was still alive in that first draft, and then later on things really kind of solidified. And I'm like, okay, no, I know how this is going to work. I know how we're going to feed this into one another. Um, because you try and plan ahead really far, but sometimes things just change because you're like, no, this is a much better idea. We got to pivot to this and run with that. Um, so I kind of lost track of your question there, but while trying to figure out my own timeline that I myself lived but can't apparently remember.
But I'm just going to reiterate, like I said, I'm loving what you do with the Moon Knight. This is the first time I maintained collecting with Moon Knight, and you've just done a phenomenal job with it. And I do think it's the most interesting series that I'm reading right now. I mean, there's a lot of
Oh,
series
thank you.
I feel like you're have seen the stories before, but this feels something totally different. Like this is its own little encased universe within Marvel at the moment. And I think it's just been geniusly written. So thank you so much.
Oh, well, thank you. I'm glad you enjoy it, and thanks for picking it up every month.
Thank you so much. Have a fantastic night, sir.
All right, you too. Bye.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Diverse the Stars podcast. Please help me battle the algorithms by liking and subscribing. Be sure to return for the next episode when comic book writer Joe Casey boards the mothership. Till next voyage, travel on.